The sun over Redemption Flats was a merciless god, hammering the cracked earth until it begged for a drop of rain that never came. The town itself was little more than a scar on the vast, unforgiving landscape. A handful of wooden buildings bleached gray by the relentless heat, huddled together as if for protection against the emptiness. The wind, when it blew, carried nothing but dust and the faint, bitter scent of sagebrush. Here, in the heart of the raw American West, law was a suggestion whispered by a weary sheriff, but power was a shout from the man with the most land and the fastest guns. Clara Bennett arrived with the midday heat, a ghost stepping from a dust-caked stagecoach. She carried a single, worn valise that held everything she owned in the world. Her dress, once a hopeful calico print, was faded and mended in a dozen places. At 19, her face still held the soft lines of youth, but her eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, held a sorrow that was years older. She was pretty in the way a wildflower is pretty, delicate and easily crushed under a careless boot. The town saw her, and the whispers began immediately. They were a currency in Redemption Flats, traded over saloon bars and dry goods counters. A lone woman, young and with no man to claim her, was a curiosity, a threat, a temptation. The good women of the town, their face pinched with righteousness, pulled their children closer as she passed. The men, lounging in the slivers of shade, watched her with a different kind of interest, a hungry, speculative gaze that made Clara's skin crawl. They saw her poverty as a sign of loose morals, her solitude as an invitation. Clara felt their stares like a physical weight. She had buried her mother a month ago, her father 2 weeks later. The drought had taken their farm, piece by piece, until all that was left were debts and 2 simple wooden crosses on a barren hillside. Redemption Flats was her last, desperate hope, a place to work, to earn enough to simply exist. She held on to her innocence like a shield, a fragile inheritance from a life that no longer existed. But in this town, innocence was just another commodity to be broken and sold. From the shaded porch of the land office, 2 men watched her arrival. One was Clayton Morrison. He was a thick, bull-necked man whose wealth was displayed in the shine of his boots and the silver conchos on his belt. He owned the Double M Ranch, and his ambition was as vast as the territory he coveted. He saw land, cattle, and people as things to be acquired, and his methods were as cruel as the country itself. He looked at Clara with the same possessive glint he gave a prime piece of grazing land. "Fresh meat," he grunted to the man beside him, a smirk twisting his lips. The other man was Ethan McGraw. He stood apart, a figure carved from silence and shadow, taller than most, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of hard work. He carried an air of quiet authority that needed no silver conchos to announce itself. He was a widower, a fact the town knew but never spoke of in his presence. Years ago, a fever had swept through his homestead. Taking his wife and young son in the space of a week, it had hollowed something out of him, leaving behind a man who ran the most prosperous ranch in the territory. The sprawling McGraw spread, with a grim, relentless efficiency. His eyes, a deep, guarded gray, followed Clara, but his expression was unreadable. He saw not fresh meat, but a familiar flicker of desperation he knew all too well. Morrison's greed was a constant, buzzing irritation. Like a fly he couldn't be bothered to swat. He despised the man's crude hunger for power, for land, for the souls of others. It was a disease, and Morrison was its most enthusiastic carrier. Clara's first stop was the general store, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. She needed to ask about work, any work. A seamstress, a cook, a laundress. Her pride was a small, hard knot in her stomach, but hunger was a more powerful force. As she stepped inside, a group of cowboys, their spurs jingling with lazy arrogance, turned from the counter. She recognized the Double M brand on their belts. "Well, look what the wind blew in," one of them drawled, his eyes roaming over her form. He was young, but his face already had the hard, mean set of a man who enjoys the fear of others. Clara ignored him, her gaze fixed on the storekeeper, a balding man who was suddenly very busy polishing his counter. Another cowboy stepped forward, blocking her path. "You lost, little lady, or you looking for a particular kind of employment?" He grinned, and his friends chuckled. The air grew thick and suffocating. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted her chin, her voice barely a whisper but steady. "I'm looking for honest work. Do you know of any—" The first cowboy laughed out loud. "Honest work." He reached out and touched the worn fabric of her valise. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't have to worry about that. Mr. Morrison. He's a generous man. Takes good care of his employees." The innuendo was as sharp as a slap. Clara flinched back, her face pale. "Please, just let me pass." "Not so fast," the second one said, his smile gone. "We're just being friendly." He took another step, cornering her against a barrel of flour. The storekeeper looked away, his complicity a cold, hard fact. In Redemption Flats, you didn't cross Clayton Morrison or his men. It was then that the screen door creaked open, and a shadow fell across the room. Ethan McGraw filled the doorway. He didn't say a word, didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, his gray eyes moving from the cowboys to Clara, taking in the scene with a chilling stillness. The air in the store changed, the lazy menace evaporating like morning mist. The cowboys shuffled their feet. The bravado drained from their faces, replaced by a sullen resentment. "That's enough," Ethan said. His voice was low, not a command so much as a statement of fact. It carried the weight of undisputed authority. "Leave the girl alone." The leader of the group bristled, trying to salvage a scrap of his pride. "We ain't doing nothing, McGraw. Just making conversation." Ethan took a slow step into the room. He didn't look at the cowboy. His gaze was fixed on Clara, a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or a tired recognition in their depths. "Your conversation is over. Now get out." There was a tense silence. The cowboys exchanged uneasy glances. They were 3 to his 1, but no one moved. Challenging Ethan McGraw was not a casual decision. They knew the stories. They knew the man. Muttering under their breath, they pushed past him and out into the street, their spurs clinking with a note of retreat. The storekeeper finally found his voice, a nervous, reedy sound. "Can I help you, Mr. McGraw?" Ethan ignored him. He looked at Clara, who stood trembling, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her valise. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice softer now. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She was caught between gratitude for her rescue and the profound humiliation of it. She was now marked, not just as a poor, lone woman, but as the object of a conflict between the 2 most powerful men in the region. "You said you were looking for work," Ethan stated. It wasn't a question. Clara found her voice. "Yes, sir. Anything—" Ethan considered her for a long moment. He saw the defiant pride in her eyes, warring with the fear. He saw the calloused hands that told of a life of labor, not leisure. He saw a resilience that reminded him, painfully, of his late wife. He was a man who lived by instinct, and his instincts told him this girl was not what the town whispered she was. He was also a practical man. His cook had run off a week ago with a traveling salesman, and his cowboys were complaining about their own burnt coffee and beans. "I need a cook and housekeeper at my ranch," he said, the words clipped and direct. "The work is hard. The pay is fair. You'll have your own room. Are you interested?" Clara stared at him, stunned. A job, a real job, offered without a leering smile or a demeaning suggestion. It was a lifeline. "Yes," she breathed, the word full of a desperate relief. "Oh, yes, sir. Thank you." My wagon's outside. Get your things." He turned and walked out without another word, leaving Clara in the quiet store. The storekeeper, now brave in the absence of Morrison's men, cleared his throat. "You be careful, miss," he advised, his tone a mix of warning and pity. "You've just stepped into the middle of something. McGraw and Morrison. They're like oil and water, and you're the spark." Clara understood. By accepting Ethan McGraw's help and his job, she had unknowingly chosen a side in a war she knew nothing about. As she stepped out into the blinding sunlight, she saw Morrison across the street, his face a mask of cold fury. His men stood beside him, watching her. Then she looked at the wagon, where Ethan McGraw sat waiting, his expression impassive. She was caught between a man's quiet protection and another's open hostility, caught in a town that would judge her for either choice. Her life of simple hardship was over. A new, more dangerous journey had just begun. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, leaving the whispers of Redemption Flats behind, she knew she was riding not just toward a job, but toward a fate she couldn't possibly imagine. The conflict was no longer just her against a prejudiced society. It was now deeply entangled with the long-simmering feud between two powerful ranchers. A feud over land, honor, and now, over her. The ride to the McGraw Ranch was a silent one. The wagon wheels groaned over the rocky terrain, leaving the gossiping maw of Redemption Flats farther behind with every turn. Clara sat straight-backed on the buckboard, her hands folded tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her. Ethan McGraw handled the reins with an easy, powerful grace, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was a landscape unto himself, rugged, quiet, and vast. He didn't offer pleasantries, and Clara, intimidated by his silence and the debt of gratitude she owed him, didn't dare to speak. They passed through a stone gateway bearing a simple, burned wood sign, McGraw. Suddenly, the land changed. The desperate, thirsty scrub gave way to rolling grasslands that stretched to the feet of the distant mountains. Healthy cattle, branded with the same simple ma, dotted the hillsides. This was not just a piece of land. It was an empire built from grit and sweat. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The ranch house sat nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, a rare patch of green that must have been nurtured by a hidden creek. It was a large, two-story structure made of thick timber and stone, built to withstand the harshest winters and the most brutal summers. It was a fortress of solitude. As they pulled up, a handful of cowboys emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, their movements slowing as they saw Clara. Ethan brought the wagon to a halt. "This is Clara Bennett," he announced to the assembled men, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "She'll be running the kitchen from now on. You'll treat her with respect. Silas, show her to the cook's room. The rest of you, get back to it." The men, a collection of weathered faces and lean, hard bodies, simply nodded. There were no welcoming smiles, only curiosity and a cautious deference to their boss. An older cowboy with a kind, craggy face and a drooping mustache stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name Silas. This way." Silas led her into the main house. The inside was clean and orderly, but starkly masculine. Dark wood, leather chairs, and the faint smell of tobacco and old wood smoke. There was no softness, no sign that a family had ever filled its halls with laughter. It felt less like a home and more like a well-run barracks. Her room was small and simple, located just off the kitchen, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window looking out over the yard. It was more than she could have hoped for. It was a haven. Clara began her new life before the sun rose the next day. The kitchen, which had been suffering from neglect, became her domain. She found the pantry well stocked, a testament to Ethan's foresight. She scrubbed the surfaces until they gleamed, stoked the wood stove, and by the time the first rays of light hit the yard, the scent of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and baking biscuits had replaced the stale air. When the cowboys filed in for breakfast, they stopped in their tracks. They were accustomed to their own sorry, often burnt efforts. The sight of a clean table, steaming platters of food, and a pot of coffee that didn't taste like tar was a minor miracle. They ate in a kind of stunned, appreciative silence. Clara worked quietly, refilling coffee cups and platters, her movements efficient and graceful. She didn't try to engage them in conversation, sensing they were a tribe that took time to accept outsiders. Her work would be her introduction. Days turned into a week, and a rhythm was established. Clara's presence began to soften the hard edges of the ranch. Small changes appeared: a jar of wildflowers on the main table, curtains washed and hung properly, the scent of baking bread in the afternoons. The cowboys started to unbend. They began to call her Miss Clara, and their conversations in her presence, while still rough, lost their coarsest edges. They were loyal to Ethan, and if he had brought her here, they would accept her. Her tireless work and the undeniable quality of her cooking made that acceptance easier. The moment that truly forged her place among them came unexpectedly. A young, cocky cowboy named Billy was breaking in a new bronc when the horse, a fiery beast, bucked him off. Billy landed hard, his arm twisting beneath him at an unnatural angle. He cried out, a sharp sound of pain that brought everyone running. They carried him into the main house, his face pale with shock, a nasty gash on his forehead bleeding freely. The men hovered awkwardly, their skills suited for roping cattle, not mending people. "Someone ride for the dock," Silas ordered. "That's a 4-hour ride, one way," another man pointed out grimly. Clara pushed through the circle of dusty, helpless men. "Bring him to the kitchen table and get me clean water, whiskey, and the sewing kit from my room," she said, her voice calm and clear. The authority in her tone surprised them, and they moved to obey without question. Her farm life had been harsh, and she had tended to more injuries, both animal and human, than any of them knew. With steady hands, she cleaned the gash on Billy's forehead. He hissed in pain as she poured a little whiskey into the wound. "This will sting," she warned softly, her touch gentle. She then stitched the cut with small, neat stitches that would leave minimal scarring for his arm, which was clearly dislocated. She looked at Silas. "I'll need you and one other to hold him steady. This will hurt more." Under her direction, they popped his shoulder back into place. Billy yelled, a raw, guttural sound, before slumping in relief. Clara fashioned a sling from a clean dish towel, her expression a mask of concentration. When she was done, she wiped the sweat from the young man's brow with a cool, damp cloth. The cowboys watched her in awe. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't swooned. She had taken control with a quiet competence that was more impressive than any blustering command. From that day on, the respect they gave her was genuine. She wasn't just the cook. She was one of them. But as Clara was being woven into the fabric of the ranch, Clayton Morrison was busy unraveling her reputation in town. When Silas next rode in for supplies, he returned with a grim look on his face. He found Ethan by the corral. "Boss, you should know what Morrison's men are saying in town," Silas said, his voice low. "They're spreading it around that Clara ain't just your cook. They're painting her as a woman of low character, saying you only took her in for one reason." Ethan's jaw tightened, his gray eyes turning to chips of ice. He had expected it. Morrison fought dirty, always aiming for a man's honor, his weak spots. By bringing Clara to the ranch, he had inadvertently made her a target. "Let them talk," Ethan said, his voice a low growl. "Their words are as worthless as they are." "The words may be worthless, but they're stickin'," Silas countered. "People are listening." Ethan knew he was right. Mud, once thrown, always left a stain. The thought of Clara's name being dragged through the filth of Morrison's making ignited a cold fury within him. It was a protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He started watching her more closely. He saw the way the setting sun caught the gold in her hair as she fed the chickens. He heard her humming a soft tune as she kneaded dough in the kitchen. He saw the genuine kindness in her eyes when she checked on Billy's arm. She was bringing his house, a place that had been a mausoleum of memory for years, back to life. A warmth began to seep into the cold, empty spaces of his heart, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. One evening, he came into the main room to find her staring at the cold, empty fireplace, her expression wistful. On the mantelpiece sat a small, silver-framed photograph of his wife, Sarah, a smiling woman with dark, laughing eyes, holding their infant son, Thomas. It was the only trace of them he allowed himself. Clara noticed his presence and immediately looked away, a blush creeping up her neck. "I'm sorry, Mr. McGraw. I wasn't prying." "It's all right," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the photograph, his thumb tracing the glass over his wife's face. The ghost of her laughter, the memory of her touch, the phantom weight of his son in his arms, it all came rushing back. A tidal wave of grief that threatened to drown him. He had built walls around his heart to keep this pain at bay, and now this quiet, unassuming girl was finding all the cracks. The nascent warmth he'd felt curdled into fear. To feel again was to risk losing again. He couldn't survive that. Not again. The shutters came down over his eyes, his expression becoming cold and distant. "The fire needs wood," he said curtly, before turning and leaving her alone in the sudden, chilling silence. Clara was left confused and hurt. She had felt a fragile connection growing between them, a silent understanding. Now, he had retreated behind a wall of ice. She didn't understand the source of his pain, but she felt its freezing effect. This, combined with the rumors she had inevitably overheard the men whispering about, began to tear at her. She was fighting a battle on two fronts. Outside, society, led by Morrison, was determined to brand her as a fallen woman. Inside, her own heart was in turmoil. She had come to the McGraw Ranch for safety and survival. Nothing more. She had promised herself she would remain detached, earn her keep, and keep her dignity intact. But she found herself thinking of Ethan McGraw not as an employer, but as a man. A sad, lonely man who carried a world of sorrow on his shoulders. She was drawn to his quiet strength, and her heart ached with an unfamiliar emotion when she saw the pain in his eyes. This new feeling terrified her. It was a betrayal of her own simple plan. To care for him was dangerous. It made her vulnerable, and it gave credence to the very rumors she despised. She was torn between guarding her heart, her last true possession, and the undeniable pull she felt toward the man who had saved her, a man who was now, for reasons she couldn't fathom, pushing her away. The world saw her as a sinner, while she felt herself struggling with the first tremulous stirrings of a love she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to fight. The chill that Ethan had cast between them lingered for days, an invisible frost in the air. Clara performed her duties with a quiet diligence, her heart aching with a confusion she couldn't voice. She felt as if she were tending a house of ghosts, with its master being the most haunted of all, the Cowboys, oblivious to the subtle shift, continued to treat her with a gruff, brotherly respect. It was this earned camaraderie that would soon shatter the tension in a way no one could have predicted. It happened in the main corral. A new hand, a boy of 17 named Luke with more bravado than sense, was trying to work with a half-wild Mustang. The horse was a magnificent creature of muscle and fury, its eyes white with fear. Luke was too rough, too loud, and the horse finally had enough. It reared, screaming, its front hooves lashing the air. Luke tumbled from its back, and in the chaos, a coil of rope snagged the horse's hind leg, pulling it tight against a fence post. Panic erupted. The horse, now tethered and terrified, thrashed wildly, threatening to snap its own leg. The men shouted advice, their own agitation feeding the animal's frenzy. Luke scrambled away on his hands and knees, his face ashen. Ethan was just striding out from the barn, his face a thundercloud, ready to take command. But before he could utter a word, a calm voice cut through the din. "Everyone, be still. You're scaring it worse." It was Clara. She stood by the corral fence, having come out to shake a tablecloth. Her face was pale but determined. She slipped between the wooden rails and began to walk slowly, deliberately toward the frantic animal. "Clara, get back!" Ethan yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. She paid him no mind. She kept her body low and moved in a soft, non-threatening arc. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing croon, the same tone she used to calm a fretful chick or a nervous calf. "Easy, boy. No one's going to hurt you." The horse continued to strain against the rope, its sides heaving, but its wild eyes fixed on her. The thrashing lessened slightly. The men fell silent, watching, mesmerized. She kept talking, a stream of soft nonsense and calming words, never taking her eyes off the horse. When she was a few feet away, she held out her hand, palm open. The Mustang snorted, its nostrils flaring, but it held its ground, inch by agonizing inch. She closed the distance. With a swift, fluid motion, she drew a small paring knife she always kept in her apron pocket and sliced through the taut rope. The instant it was free, the horse leaped back, snorted once more, and then galloped to the far side of the corral, where it stood trembling but whole. A collective sigh of relief went through the cowboys. Luke stared, open-mouthed. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs from a fear he hadn't admitted to himself. He had watched her walk toward what could have been a fatal kick, and he had been utterly powerless. He saw not a fragile girl, but a woman of immense, quiet courage. The icy wall around his heart didn't just crack, a whole section of it crumbled to dust. That evening, he approached her as she tidied the kitchen. "What you did today," he began, his voice raspy. "That was a damn foolish thing." Clara turned, her expression unreadable. "It was the only thing to do. The horse would have broken its leg." "You could have been killed." "I grew up on a farm, Mr. McGraw," she said softly. "Fear is a language animals understand. You just have to know how to speak it." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the sorrow and poverty to the bedrock of strength beneath. He realized how much he had misjudged her, how much he had allowed his own ghosts to color his perception. "Thank you, Clara," he said, the name feeling natural on his lips for the first time, "for saving the horse and the boy." From that day, something shifted between them. The formal Mr. McGraw and Miss Bennett fell away. He began to call her Clara, and she, tentatively, began to call him Ethan. He started to entrust her with tasks outside the kitchen. He showed her the ranch ledgers, and her neat, precise handwriting soon brought order to his chaotic accounts. He asked for her opinion on a new bull he was considering buying. He found himself seeking out her company, manufacturing reasons to be in the house when he would normally be out on the range. These small moments of shared work and quiet conversation began to weave a delicate but strong thread between them. The culmination of this fragile new intimacy came on a clear, cool Saturday night. To celebrate the end of a long, arduous cattle branding, the cowboys had built a massive bonfire in the yard. One of the hands, a man named Jeb, had a fiddle he played with more enthusiasm than skill, but the lively, screeching tunes were enough. The men were drinking, laughing, and telling tall tales, their face ruddy in the firelight. Clara stood at the edge of the light, a shawl around her shoulders. Feeling both a part of the scene and separate from it, it was a boisterous, masculine world, but it was the closest thing to a family she'd had in a long time. Ethan was there, too, leaning against a porch post, a cup of coffee in his hand, a rare, small smile on his lips as he watched his men. Their eyes met across the flickering flames. For a long moment, the noise and laughter of the others seemed to fade into a distant hum. In that look, Clara saw not just the lonely rancher, but a man weary of his own solitude. She saw a flicker of longing that mirrored her own. He pushed himself off the post and walked toward her. The cowboys quieted slightly, watching their boss. He stopped in front of her, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his rugged face. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "would you dance with me?" A collective, silent intake of breath seemed to come from the circle of men. Ethan McGraw did not dance. A gasp caught in Clara's throat. She could only nod, her heart suddenly beating a wild rhythm against her ribs. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He led her to an open space near the fire and turned to face her. He put one hand on her waist, and she tentatively placed her hand on his shoulder. Jeb, sensing the gravity of the moment, slowed his fiddling to a simple, mournful waltz. They began to move, a little awkwardly at first, two people unaccustomed to such closeness, but then they found a rhythm. The world shrank to the circle of firelight, the sound of the fiddle, and the man holding her. She looked up into his eyes and saw an unguarded tenderness that made her breath catch. He looked down at her, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the pure, simple joy of holding a woman in his arms. It wasn't a betrayal of his past, but a whisper of a possible future. He tightened his hold slightly, pulling her closer, and she leaned into his strength, feeling safe, feeling cherished. Their moment was so profound, so complete, that neither of them saw the rider who had approached in the darkness, watching them from the edge of the ranch yard. The next afternoon, Clara walked to the small creek that bordered the property to gather mint. As she knelt by the water, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Clayton Morrison on his black stallion, looking down at her like a hawk eyeing a rabbit. Her blood ran cold. "Mr. Morrison," she said, rising slowly to her feet. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice a smooth, oily purr as he dismounted. "Working hard, as usual. McGraw has you fetching weeds now." "It's for tea," she said, her chin lifted. "Of course." He took a step closer, his bulk seeming to suck the air from around her. "I've been hearing things in town, things about you. It's a shame. Really, a pretty young woman like yourself, having her name dragged through the mud." "I imagine it is," Clara said pointedly. He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Don't mistake me. I don't believe a word of it. I believe you're a victim, stuck out here with a man who prefers the company of ghosts, a man who lets his new cook dance in the dirt because he can't provide her with a proper ballroom." His words, meant to wound, only strengthened her resolve. "I am not a victim, and I am not stuck." "Aren't you?" Morrison's smile was gone, replaced by a predatory intensity. "Look, I'll be plain. This is no life for you. Leave McGraw. Come with me. I'll set you up as the housekeeper at my ranch. You'll have fine dresses, a warm house, the respect of the town. I can give you protection. I can give you anything you want." The implication hung heavy and ugly in the air. Clara felt a wave of revulsion. "My loyalty can't be bought, Mr. Morrison." "Loyalty," he sneered. "Loyalty to what? To a broken man and a pile of rocks. I'm offering you a future, a safe one. Think about it. Continue on here, and this town will chew you up and spit you out. They're already sharpening their teeth." "No," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. Mr. McGraw gave me work when I had nothing. He gave me respect. That is worth more than any dress you could buy. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back." She tried to step past him, but he blocked her way. "You're making a mistake, girl," he hissed, his face dark with fury. "A big one. You'll regret this." He held her gaze for another terrifying second before turning, mounting his horse, and riding away, leaving the scent of his anger lingering in the air. Clara ran back to the house, her heart pounding. She didn't tell Ethan what had happened, not wanting to pour fuel on the fire she knew burned between the two men, but Morrison was true to his word. 2 days later, Silas returned from Redemption Flats, his face grimmer than a winter storm. He found Ethan and Clara in the kitchen, going over the supply ledgers. "Ethan," Silas said, forgoing any preamble, "it's bad. Morrison's been talking to everyone. The preacher, the mayor's wife, everyone. He's saying Clara's a blight on the whole territory, a corrupting influence. He's worked them up into a lather." "Let them talk," Ethan growled, but there was a new line of worry etched between his eyes. "It's more than talk now," Silas said, his gaze shifting sadly to Clara. "They've called a town meeting for Saturday. The town council, they're going to hold a public hearing about the moral situation at the McGraw Ranch." He took a deep breath. "Ethan, they mean to run her out." The news of the town meeting settled over the ranch like a shroud. The 2 days leading up to it were heavy with a silent, oppressive tension. Every cowboy on the McGraw spread knew what was at stake, and a grim, protective loyalty settled over them. They moved with a quiet purpose, their eyes harder, their jaws set. They were McGraw men, and Clara was now under their protection. But it was a threat that couldn't be met with guns or fists, and that helplessness soured the air. Ethan was a caged storm. He drove himself and his men relentlessly, as if hard labor could build a wall against Morrison's insidious attack. But when he looked at Clara, he saw the strain in the tight set of her shoulders and the haunted look in her eyes, and a cold, gut-wrenching fury would seize him. This was his fault. He had brought her into his war. On the evening before the meeting, the sky began to bleed from bruised purple into a sickly yellow-gray. The air grew heavy and still, unnaturally quiet. The birds stopped singing. An ominous pressure built, mirroring the unspoken dread in the ranch house. Then, the wind began to whisper, a low moan that quickly rose to a shriek, the first drops of rain, fat and heavy as coins, splattered against the dusty ground. Within minutes, the heavens opened. It was not a cleansing rain, but a violent biblical deluge. A wall of water, driven by a gale-force wind, slammed into the ranch. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the timber frame house to its foundations, and lightning tore jagged white fissures across the black sky, offering terrifying, instantaneous portraits of a world gone mad. The cowboys rushed to secure the livestock in the barn. Ethan and Clara worked together in the main house, barring the heavy storm shutters over the windows, plunging the rooms into a dim, lamplit twilight. The roar of the storm was deafening, a constant, chaotic assault that isolated them completely from the outside world. With the house secured, they found themselves in the kitchen, the warmest and most central room. The iron stove radiated a steady heat, a small anchor of civilization in the tempest. The noise of the rain on the roof was a deafening drum roll. They stood on opposite sides of the room, the space between them charged with everything left unsaid. The storm had stripped away all pretense, all possibility of escape. There was only this room, this night, and the confrontation they could no longer avoid. "I should leave," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the din. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed on the water streaming down the outside of the window pane. "In the morning, before the meeting, it would be better for you." Ethan slammed his palm down on the heavy wooden table. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. "No!" he bit out, the word raw with fury. "You will not run from this. We will not run from this." It's not running, she argued, finally turning to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's protecting you. Your name. This ranch. Morrison is doing this because of me. If I'm gone, if you're gone, he wins. Ethan's voice rose, cracking with an emotion he no longer tried to contain. He began to pace the narrow space between the stove and the table like a trapped animal. Do you think this is about you? It was always going to be something. The water rights, a line fence, a stray calf. He wants to break me. You're just the weapon he's decided to use. I don't want to be a weapon, she whispered. He stopped, his back to her, his broad shoulders trembling with the force of his rage. And I don't want you to be hurt. He turned around slowly, and the anger in his face had been replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability that stunned her into silence. The mask of the stoic, unbreachable rancher was gone. In his place was a man terrified of loss. I buried my wife and my son in the same week, he said, his voice hoarse, each word torn from a place of deep, unhealed pain. I buried my heart with them. I swore to myself. I swore I would never feel anything again. It was safer to be empty, to just work the land and wait for the years to pass. He took a step toward her, his gray eyes burning with a desperate intensity. Then you came, so quiet and so damn strong. You walked into this house and you brought it back to life. You brought me back to life. And I hate myself for it, because all I can think about is that meeting tomorrow. All I can think about is them driving you away. And the thought of losing you. Clara, it feels like I'm burying them all over again. I can't do it. I won't survive it a second time. His confession, so raw and torn from the soul, shattered her own carefully constructed defenses. Tears streamed freely down her face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion. This was the man behind the silence, the heart behind the armor. She closed the distance between them, her hands coming up to cup his jaw, her small palms against his rough, unshaven skin. Ethan, she breathed, her own voice thick with tears. I was so frightened when I came here, frightened of the town, of being alone, of what everyone would think. But I was wrong. The only thing I'm truly frightened of is losing you. I think I have been from the very beginning. The dam broke. With a groan that was part anguish, part relief, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. His embrace wasn't gentle, it was desperate, the embrace of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on just as tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other as the storm raged around them, two solitudes merging into one. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumbs wiping away her tears. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of tentative romance, but of desperate, soul-deep recognition. It tasted of salt and rain and years of loneliness. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken word, every shared glance, every secret hope. When the kiss broke, they were both breathless. The air was thick, electric. He led her to the small rag rug in front of the warm stove, and they knelt, facing each other in the flickering lamplight. The world was gone. There was only the sound of the rain, the warmth of the fire, and the overwhelming reality of the person in front of them. He began to unbutton the high collar of her dress, his fingers clumsy but tender. Each button undone was an act of trust, a layer of protection falling away. His gaze never left hers, asking for permission with every touch. When his hand brushed the delicate skin of her collarbone, a violent shudder ran through her. This was the precipice, the final, terrifying edge of surrender. All the whispers of the town, all her fears of being seen as a ruined woman, all the pain of her past losses, it all rose up in a wave of panic. As his fingers traced the line of her shoulder, She flinched, pulling back slightly. Her voice was a broken, trembling whisper, a plea against her own heart's deepest desire. "Don't touch there." It was the last bastion of her fear, the final wall around a heart that had been offered nothing but hardship. To give this last part of herself away was to risk utter annihilation. Ethan stopped. He looked into her terrified, pleading eyes, and he understood. She was not denying him. She was showing him her soul, her most vulnerable, fragile place. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. His voice, when he spoke, was not a command, not a boast, but the softest, most resolute vow she had ever heard. It was a promise to protect, to cherish, to claim not just her body, but her fears. "It's mine now." He was not taking. He was accepting. He was claiming the right to shelter her, to defend her, to love the part of her that was most afraid. A single tear rolled from her eye, a tear of release. The fear vanished, replaced by a profound, soul-settling peace. He had seen her deepest vulnerability and had not turned away. He kissed her again, and this time there was no desperation, only a deep, abiding certainty. He gently laid her back on the rug, his movements full of a reverence that bordered on worship. In the warm, flickering light of the kitchen, sheltered from the fury of the storm, they came together. It was a quiet, solemn union, an affirmation of the vow he had just made. In that moment, he chose her forever, and in her complete, trusting surrender, she chose him back. Later, as the storm's fury abated to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, they lay wrapped in a blanket before the glowing embers of the stove. The charged tension was gone, replaced by a deep, unbreakable calm. They were no longer a lonely rancher and his frightened housekeeper. They were a single entity, a united front. Clara traced the lines of his hand, her fingers tangling with his. "Tomorrow," she whispered into the quiet. Ethan pulled her closer, his lips brushing her hair. "Tomorrow," he affirmed, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We face them together." They both knew the truth. This night hadn't solved their problems. It had magnified them. Their love, now confessed and consummated, was a declaration of war. Morrison would not stand for this. The town would not be easily swayed. The storm outside was ending. But their own storm, the one they would have to walk into hand in hand, was just about to break. But for the first time, neither of them felt alone in the thunder. The world was born anew in the morning. The storm had scoured the landscape, leaving the air clean and crisp and the earth a rich, dark brown, smelling of rain and life. But inside the McGraw ranch house, the quiet was heavy, charged with the gravity of the day to come. There was no trace of the fear and desperation of the night before. In its place was a solemn, unbreakable resolve. They moved around each other in the kitchen, a silent dance of two people who now shared one soul. When Ethan brought the wagon around, he helped Clara onto the seat, not with the formal distance of an employer, but with the tender, possessive care of a husband. The ride to Redemption Flats was a stark contrast to her first journey. She was no longer a solitary, desperate girl. She sat tall beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a simple gesture that was a bold and open declaration. As they drove down the main street, windows and doorways filled with faces, the whispers were there. But they were different now, laced with shock and a grudging respect for the sheer defiance of their arrival. They were not coming to beg for mercy. They were coming to face a verdict. Together. The town meeting was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the righteous and the curious. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sawdust, and sanctimony. The entire town seemed to be there, packed onto benches and standing along the walls. Mayor Abernathy, a man whose spine was as pliable as his political promises, sat at a makeshift table at the front, flanked by the stern-faced Reverend Miller. But the true center of power in the room was Clayton Morrison, who sat in the front row, looking smug and confident, his men arrayed behind him like a phalanx of bullies. The mayor cleared his throat, tapping a gavel weakly. "This meeting of the town council is now in session," he began, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We are here to discuss a matter of public concern, a matter of moral character that affects the good name of our community." Morrison rose to his feet, not waiting to be called upon. He commanded the room's attention instantly. "Mayor, Reverend, good people of Redemption Flats," he started, his voice dripping with false piety. "It is a sad day when we must gather to address a rot that has taken root among us. We are a God-fearing community. We work hard. We raise our families with decent values. But those values are being threatened." He turned, pointing a dramatic finger toward the back of the room where Ethan and Clara stood. "This man, Ethan McGraw, a man we have long respected, has brought a shadow into our midst. He has installed a woman of unknown and questionable background into his home, a home filled with young, impressionable men. He flaunts this arrangement, this impropriety, in our faces. What are our wives and daughters to think? What kind of example is this? I speak not from malice, but from a deep concern for the soul of this town." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The women, in particular, nodded, their faces pinched with judgment. They saw Clara's poverty, her solitude, and now her open association with McGraw as proof of everything Morrison implied. Before the murmur could swell into a roar of condemnation, Ethan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet, deadly intensity in his eyes was enough to silence the room. "You're right about one thing, Morrison," Ethan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the saloon's stale air. "We are here to discuss character, so let's do that." He swept his gaze over the crowd, meeting the eyes of ranchers, merchants, and their wives. "This woman," he said, turning slightly to indicate Clara, his voice softening with a fierce protectiveness, "came to this town with nothing but the clothes on her back and 2 hands willing to work. She came here after burying both her parents. Where was your God-fearing concern? Then did any of you offer her a meal, a job? No. You offered her whispers. You offered her leers. You offered her your judgment." He took another step forward, his focus now entirely on Morrison. "I offered her a job, cooking and cleaning, a job she has done better than anyone I have ever employed. She has worked from sunup to sundown without a single word of complaint. She tended to one of my men when he was injured, with more skill and courage than many men I know. That is her character." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You want to talk about shadows? Morrison, the only shadow I see is the one cast by your greed. You don't care about this town's soul. You care about my land and my water. You have tried to poison my cattle and steal my men, and now you are trying to poison this woman's name because you see her as a way to wound me. Well, you are mistaken." He turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Clara Bennett is a woman of honor and courage. She is under my protection. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Any threat against her is a threat against my ranch. Consider that before you cast your stones." A stunned silence fell over the room. No one had ever heard Ethan McGraw speak so many words at once, let alone with such raw, passionate conviction. Morrison's face was a mask of thunderous fury. He had expected a simple denial, not a full-throated defense that turned the accusation back on him. But before the mayor could find his voice to intervene, another sound, quiet but clear, cut through the tension. It was Clara. She stepped out from behind Ethan's shadow, her hands clasped in front of her, her head held high. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the memory of the previous night, of Ethan's vow, gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am not a shadow," she said, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength with every word. I am a person. My name is Clara Bennett. My father was Jacob Bennett. He was an honest farmer until the drought took everything from him, just as it has from some of you." She looked at the faces in the crowd, seeing not a mob, but individuals. "When I came to your town, I was a stranger. I understand that, but I did not ask for charity. I asked for work. Mr. McGraw gave it to me. I have done my best to earn my wage and his respect." Her eyes found the young cowboy, Billy, standing awkwardly in the corner, his arm still in a sling. "Some of you speak of my character. Character is not made of rumors. It's made of what you do. I have cooked your food, mended your clothes, and when a man was hurt, I helped him because it was the right thing to do." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Silas had made sure the story of her tending to Billy was known, and it stood in stark contrast to the vague, ugly picture Morrison was painting. Clara then turned her clear, unwavering gaze directly on Clayton Morrison. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her quiet dignity was a more powerful weapon than his bluster. "The only dishonor I have found in this territory," she said, her voice ringing with truth, "is the belief that a person's worth is measured by the coins in their pocket, or that a woman's good name is something a powerful man can try to tarnish for his own purposes. My honor is not for sale, Mr. Morrison, and it is not for you to judge." The silence in the saloon was absolute. She had not only defended herself, she had exposed the core of Morrison's rotten character for all to see. He stood there, his face turning a blotchy red, speechless with rage and public humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered and shamed, not by a powerful rival, but by the very woman he had sought to destroy. Mayor Abernathy, seeing his chance, banged the gavel with renewed vigor. "This matter is clearly a private one between ranchers. This meeting is adjourned." The crowd broke apart in a flurry of excited, confused murmurs. The solid wall of condemnation had been shattered. While many still held to their suspicions, a seed of doubt had been planted. They had seen Clara Bennett not as a caricature of a fallen woman, but as a person of substance and courage. As Ethan led her out of the saloon, several townspeople who had previously shunned her met her eye with a new, grudging respect. The ride back to the ranch was as quiet as the ride in, but the silence was different. It was the silence of a battle won, but with the knowledge that the war was far from over. The enemy's response came that night. It was swift and brutal. Under the cover of darkness, Morrison's men rode onto McGraw land. They did not attack the house. Their work was quieter, more insidious. The next morning, it was Silas who found it. A half-mile stretch of fence along the northern pasture had been cut to ribbons. Wires snipped, posts kicked down. Cattle, hundreds of them, were scattered across the open range. Some already wandering onto Morrison's territory, a perfect excuse for him to reclaim them as his own. But that wasn't the worst of it. Burned into the main gatepost of the ranch, seared deep into the wood with a branding iron, was a single, chilling message. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. "The next time it will be blood." Ethan stood before the gate, his hand resting on the hilt of the pistol at his hip. Clara beside him. The victory in the saloon felt hollow now, a mere skirmish before the real battle. He looked at the scattered herd, at the violated fence line, and at the brutal promise burned into his gate. He finally understood. This was no longer a feud over reputation or a fight for a woman's honor. Morrison had been publicly shamed, and a man like that could not let it stand. He would not stop until he had destroyed everything Ethan had built, everything he held dear. This was now a war for survival, written not in whispers and rumors, but in the language of the West, the language of violence, fire, and blood. And it was coming for them. The 2 days that followed were the calm at the heart of the hurricane. A heavy, watchful silence descended upon the McGraw ranch, thick with the unspoken knowledge of what was to come. Every man knew the brand on the gate was not a threat, but a promise. Ethan organized his defenses with a grim, methodical precision. Rifles were cleaned and loaded. Ammunition was distributed, and vantage points were assigned in the house, the barn, and the bunkhouse, the ranch. Once a place of open plains and hard work, had become a fortress awaiting a siege. Ethan's shadow was never far from Clara. He was a storm cloud of protective energy, his face carved from granite. On the second night, as darkness bled across the sky, he came to her in the kitchen. The lamps were lit, casting a warm, deceptive glow of domestic peace. "Clara," he said, his voice low and strained. "When they come, I want you in the root cellar. It's the safest place. Bar the door from the inside and don't come out. No matter what you hear, do you understand?" She was wiping down the long wooden table, and she didn't stop, her movement steady and deliberate. She had anticipated this. "And where will you be?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I will be where I need to be." She stopped her work and finally looked at him. The love that had been born in a storm now faced a fire, and it had forged her fear into steel. "My parents' farm was taken by the drought," she said softly. "But they never ran from it. They faced it until the end. On their land. This is my home now. Ethan, my place is with you." "This is not a drought. Clara, this is Morrison. It will be gunfire and death." The desperation in his voice was a raw, open wound. He had just found her. The thought of losing her was an agony he could not bear. "I know," she said. She walked over to the wall where several rifles were propped. She picked one up, a heavy Winchester that felt alien but purposeful in her hands. She had learned to shoot as a girl, to protect the chickens from foxes. She had never imagined this. "I will not hide in a cellar while my home is under attack and the man I love is fighting for his life. My place is by your side." He looked at her steady hands, her unwavering gaze, the fierce resolve in the set of her jaw, and he saw that to argue further would be to insult the very strength he had fallen in love with. A terrible pride swelled in his chest, mingled with a paralyzing fear. He gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. The attack came just before midnight. The moon was a sliver, shrouded by clouds. The first warning was a dog's frantic bark, cut short by a sickening yelp. Then, the night erupted. A volley of gunfire shattered the windows of the main house. Glass exploded inward, and the lamps on the tables flickered and died. Simultaneously, a bright orange light flared from the direction of the barn. "They're trying to burn us out," Silas roared from his position by a front window. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of violence. Shouts, the crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the terrified screaming of horses. Muzzle flashes lit the yard in brief. Hellish tableaus, revealing dark figures moving between the buildings, using the shadows for cover. Ethan, Clara, and Silas were in the main house, which had become the command center. Billy and two other hands were in the bunkhouse, laying down a crossfire. The rest were in the barn, trying to save the livestock and fight the spreading flames. "They're trying to split us up," Ethan yelled over the din. "Hold your positions. Make every shot count." Clara knelt beside an overturned table, the rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were surprisingly steady. She sighted down the barrel, aimed at a running shadow illuminated by the burning barn, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard, and the shadow fell. A wave of nausea and grim satisfaction washed over her. This was survival. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with acrid smoke and the coppery smell of blood. A bullet tore through the wall next to Clara's head, showering her with splinters. She didn't flinch. She reloaded, her movements becoming mechanical. Her focus narrowed to the deadly dance of shadows outside. From the bunkhouse, young Billy's rifle spoke with a steady rhythm. He and the others had pinned down a group of Morrison's men trying to advance on the house. Then, a torch arced through the air, landing on the bunkhouse roof. Within minutes, it, too, was ablaze. "They have to get out of there," Silas yelled, firing a shot that sent one of the attackers sprawling. The bunkhouse door burst open and the 3 cowboys ran out, firing as they sprinted for the relative safety of the main house. 2 of them made it, Billy, the youngest, the boy Clara had saved from a wild horse, stumbled and fell, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He didn't get up. A cry of pure anguish tore from Silas's throat. He rose from his cover, his face a mask of grief and fury, and fired his pistol wildly at the men who had shot the boy. "You bastards!" he screamed.
"Silas, get down!"
Ethan roared. But it was too late. A rifle cracked from the darkness, and the old cowboy staggered back, his hand clutching his side. He slid down the wall, leaving a bloody smear, his eyes wide with surprise. Ethan scrambled to his side, but one look told him everything. Silas gripped his arm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Protect the girl," he rasped, and then the light went out of his eyes. Grief, savage and blinding, ripped through Ethan. Silas had been with him for 20 years. He was more than a foreman. He was family, and now he was gone. But there was no time for grief. There was only time for rage. The main assault on the house began. Morrison's men, sensing a shift in the fight, charged from the darkness. It was then that Clara saw him, Clayton Morrison, standing near the corral, not firing, but directing his men like a malevolent general. And he was looking directly at the window where Ethan was crouched, his face contorted with the grief of losing Silas. Morrison raised his own pistol, taking careful, deliberate aim. Time seemed to slow down. The roar of the battle faded to a dull hum in Clara's ears. She saw the glint of the pistol barrel, the cold certainty in Morrison's eyes, the utter vulnerability of Ethan's exposed back. She didn't shout a warning. There wasn't time. She didn't think. She only acted. With a desperate cry, she launched herself across the floor, crashing into Ethan with the full force of her body. Her momentum threw them both sideways, away from the window, just as Morrison's gun fired. The bullet, meant for Ethan's heart, tore through the fleshy part of Clara's shoulder instead. A searing, white-hot pain exploded through her. The force of it slammed her against the floor. For a moment, the world went black, then returned in a haze of agony. Ethan, thrown off balance, twisted around to see her on the floor, her hand pressed to her shoulder, blood seeping through her fingers. The sight of her blood, shed for him, broke something inside him, the last of his restraint, the last vestige of the civilized man he had once been, snapped. A sound that was not human came from his throat. He looked at Clara, then at the doorway, and then he rose. He moved with a terrifying, deadly grace, a walking embodiment of vengeance. He stepped out onto the porch, ignoring the bullets that whistled past him, his 2 pistols now in his hands.
"Morrison!"
he bellowed, his voice echoing across the war-torn yard. The fighting faltered as every man, on both sides, turned to look. Morrison, surprised that his shot had missed its mark, stood in the open, a sneer on his face. "So, the ghost finally comes out to fight," Morrison taunted. Ethan didn't reply with words. He advanced slowly, steadily, across the yard, firing with a cold, terrifying precision. Morrison's men, seeing the look on his face, began to fall back. This was no longer a battle for land. This was an execution. Morrison, his arrogance turning to alarm, raised his pistol and fired. The shot went wide. Ethan kept walking, kept firing. One of Morrison's men fell, then another. They broke and ran, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, leaving their master to his fate. Now it was just the 2 of them, 20 yards apart, surrounded by the dead and the dying, illuminated by the hellish light of the burning buildings.
This is for Silas,
Ethan roared, firing his left pistol. The bullet struck Morrison in the leg, and he cried out, stumbling to one knee. This is for Billy. He fired his right. The shot hit Morrison's gun hand, sending his pistol flying into the dirt. Ethan stopped, standing over the wounded, disarmed man. Morrison looked up, his face a mixture of pain, hatred, and for the first time, fear.
You're a dead man, McGraw,
Morrison spat, clutching his shattered hand. Not today, Ethan said, his voice as cold as a grave. He didn't shoot. He holstered his pistols. He reached down, grabbed Morrison by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. He began to drag him toward the burning barn, where the terrified horses were still kicking and screaming in their stalls.
What are you doing?
Morrison shrieked, struggling feebly. Ethan's face was a mask of cold fury.
You brought fire and death to my home. It's time you met them.
In the chaos, a section of the barn's burning roof collapsed inward with a great roar, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. A panicked horse, its eyes white with terror, burst through its stall, its mane on fire. It galloped blindly into the yard, a creature of pure, unreasoning panic. It ran directly toward the two struggling men. Ethan, reacting on pure instinct, threw Morrison away from him and dove to the side. Morrison, caught off guard and injured, stumbled backward, directly into the path of the stampeding, burning animal. There was a sickening thud of impact, a human scream cut short, and then the horse was gone, disappearing into the darkness, a fleeting specter of fire and death. Clayton Morrison lay twisted and broken in the dirt. His reign of terror ended not by a bullet, but by the very chaos he had unleashed. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the moans of the wounded. The battle was over. Ethan staggered to his feet, the rage draining out of him, leaving a vast, hollow emptiness. He looked at Morrison's body, feeling nothing. He turned and ran back to the house, his heart pounding with a single, overriding terror. Clara. He found her where he had left her, propped against the wall, pale but conscious, her teeth gritted against the pain. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her wound, afraid to touch her.
"Ethan,"
she whispered, her eyes fluttering open.
"You're safe."
Tears, hot and searing, streamed down his face. He gently gathered her into his arms, cradling her head against his chest. He had won. His ranch was saved. But as he looked out at the smoldering ruins of his life, at the bodies of the men who had died for him, and felt the warm stickiness of Clara's blood against his hands, he knew that the price of this victory was a wound that might never truly heal. The dawn that broke over the McGraw ranch was mercilessly clear. It illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The smoldering skeletons of the barn and bunkhouse stood black against the pristine blue sky. The yard was a churned mess of mud, blood, and debris, littered with the bodies of men and horses. The night's violence had left a silence that was deeper and more profound than the preceding roar. Inside the house, the chaos was internalized. Ethan, moving like a man in a trance, had laid Clara gently on the kitchen table. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, a painful but not life-threatening wound. His hands, accustomed to the rough work of roping cattle and mending fences, were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound with whiskey and packed it with clean linen. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were wild with a terror that hadn't left him since she fell. He dispatched Jeb, one of the few surviving, uninjured cowboys, to ride for Dr. Evans in Redemption Flats.
Ride like the devil himself is on your tail,
Ethan had ordered, his voice a raw rasp. The news hit the town like a physical shock wave. Jeb, his face smudged with soot and his eyes hollow, didn't spare the details. He told the story in the middle of the street, his voice cracking with grief and exhaustion. He spoke of the siege, of Morrison's treachery, and of the deaths of Silas and Billy. And then he told them how Clara Bennett had fought alongside them, how she had taken a bullet meant for Ethan McGraw. The whispers that had once condemned her now repeated the story in tones of hushed, disbelieving awe. When Dr. Evans arrived hours later, his face was grim. He took in the battlefield in the yard, the grim-faced cowboy standing guard, and the cold bodies laid out under blankets. He said nothing, but his expression hardened. Inside, he tended to Clara's wound with professional efficiency. "You're a very lucky, very foolish, and very brave young woman," he said as he bandaged her shoulder. "That bullet was a hair's breadth from your lung." "Is Ethan all right?" was her only question, her voice weak. "He's in one piece." The doctor grunted, glancing at Ethan, who stood like a stone sentinel in the corner. "Physically, at least." On his way out, Dr. Evans stopped and put a hand on Ethan's arm. "The boy, Jeb, he told the town what happened, what she did." He paused. "The story is a little different now. McGraw, you'll find things have changed." The days that followed were a purgatory of grief and labor. They buried Silas and young Billy on a low hill that overlooked the vast expanse of the ranch, under the shade of a lone, resilient oak. There were no grand words, only the raw, choked silence of the surviving men and the silent tears that streamed down Clara's face. Ethan stood over the fresh graves, his hat in his hands, his face unreadable, but a part of him was buried there with them. He threw himself into the work of rebuilding with a frantic, punishing energy. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, his grief a silent, relentless fuel. The remaining cowboys worked alongside him, their loyalty to him now absolute, forged in the crucible of shared combat and loss. Clara, with her arm in a sling, was unable to lift or build. Instead, she became the quiet heart of their recovery. She ran the house, cooked nourishing meals that brought a semblance of normality to their shattered world, and tended to the men's smaller injuries and their larger sorrows. Most of all, she tended to Ethan. He had retreated again, not behind the wall of ice she had first encountered, but into a silent cavern of guilt and pain. He was haunted. In the dead of night, she would hear him cry out in his sleep, reliving the battle, seeing the faces of the men he'd lost. She would go to him then, not speaking, but simply sitting in a chair by his bed until the tremors passed. She was a quiet, constant presence, a lighthouse in his storm. She would bring him a plate of food in the evenings as he sat staring into the cold fireplace, and she would not leave until he ate. She learned to read his silences. She knew when to sit with him and when to leave him be. One night, as she was about to leave his room, he spoke, his voice a rough whisper in the darkness. "It was my fault. I brought this on them. On you." She turned back and walked to his chair, kneeling before him and taking his large, calloused hand in both of her good ones. "It was Morrison's fault," she said, her voice fierce. "This was his evil, not yours. You gave those men a home and a loyalty they chose to honor. You gave me a life. We fought for our home, Ethan, together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and for the first time since the night of the attack, he let the full weight of his grief wash over him. His body shook with silent, racking sobs. She held him, her small frame a surprising anchor, and absorbed his sorrow, proving that their bond was now strong enough to bear not just passion, but unbearable pain. As Dr. Evans had predicted, things began to change. A few days after the battle, a wagon from Redemption Flats rumbled up the lane. It was the storekeeper, his face etched with an awkward sympathy. He unloaded sacks of flour, coffee, and salted meat. "On the house," he mumbled, refusing to meet Ethan's eyes. "For your trouble. The town. We're sorry." He was the first of many. ranchers from neighboring spreads, men who had once kept a wary distance, rode over offering men and materials to help with the rebuilding. They brought stray cattle back, no questions asked. Mayor Abernathy himself made the trip, his hat in his hand, and delivered a stammering, formal apology on behalf of the town council. When they spoke of Clara, the name was different now. No one called her Miss Bennett. To the men, she was simply Clara. To the townspeople, she was something more. They called her the Woman of McGraw Ranch. It was a title spoken with a new tone, one of deep, hard-won respect. They were acknowledging her place, her right to be there, a right she had claimed with her own blood and courage. About a month after the attack, the new frames of the barn and bunkhouse were rising toward the sky, raw and pale against the horizon. The ranch was scarred but healing. One evening, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the clouds in hues of rose and gold. The peace was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with a quiet sense of promise. "I saw the Reverend Miller in town yesterday," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He sends his regards, asked after you."
That was kind of him,
Clara said, sensing there was more. Ethan turned to her, his expression serious, the lines of grief on his face softened by the evening light. "He also asked about us, about our intentions." He took her hand, the one that wasn't in a sling, and held it. "I told him this ranch has been without a proper mistress for too long. I told him I intended to ask you to be my wife." His gaze was direct, vulnerable. "I know this isn't the right way. There's no fancy parlor, and I don't have a ring to offer you. It feels inadequate after everything." Clara smiled, a true, radiant smile that seemed to light up the twilight. She raised his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "Ethan McGraw, after everything we have been through, do you truly think I care about a fancy parlor?" She stepped closer, laying her head against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "My answer was yes the night you told me my heart was yours. It will always be yes." The wedding was as simple and strong as the land itself. It took place a week later, not in the church, but on the ranch, under the open sky, with the healing land as their cathedral. The Reverend Miller came, his Bible in hand. The entire surviving population of the McGraw Ranch stood as groomsmen, their faces scrubbed, their hair slicked down, their respect for the bride shining in their eyes. And the town came. Dr. Evans was there, as was the storekeeper and his wife. Mayor Abernathy stood near the front. Even a few of the town's most pious women, who had once been so quick to judge her, came and stood quietly at the back, their presence a silent testament to her transformation in their eyes. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had carefully mended, the one she had owned before the calico. It was the color of a clear sky after a storm. Ethan stood beside her, tall and proud, and their vows were not whispered, but spoken clearly, their voices carrying on the gentle breeze. They were promises made not in hopeful ignorance, but in the full, sober knowledge of what it meant to fight for and almost lose everything. When the Reverend finally said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," a cheer went up from the cowboys. Ethan didn't kiss his bride with gentle decorum. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a deep, possessive passion, a public declaration for all to see. This was his wife. The celebration was held in the yard. Amidst the ongoing construction, Jeb played his fiddle, and the mournful waltzes had been replaced by lively, hopeful reels. They were a small, battered family, but they were whole. As the evening wore on, Ethan stood with his arm wrapped firmly around his wife's waist. When the mayor came to offer his congratulations, Ethan smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Mayor," he said, his voice full of a pride that resonated deeper than his ownership of the land. "I'd like to formally introduce you to my wife, Clara McGraw." Months bled one into the next, and the raw, violent scars on the land began to heal. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwood leaves in brilliant strokes of gold and orange. The new barn and bunkhouse stood proud and strong, the fresh-cut pine smelling of resilience and new beginnings. The rhythm of the ranch returned, quieter and more somber than before, but steady, like a heartbeat that had survived a terrible fever. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Ethan and Clara walked hand in hand up the low hill to the place where the lone oak stood guard. Two simple wooden crosses, weathered now by the sun and rain, marked the graves of Silas and Billy. It had become a ritual for them, a quiet pilgrimage to honor the men who had paid the ultimate price for their home. They stood in silence for a long time, looking out over the sprawling valley that was their world. The cattle, their numbers diminished but their stock strong, grazed peacefully. The smoke from the cookhouse chimney rose in a thin, straight line into the clear, cool air. It was a portrait of peace, a peace that felt both profound and fragile. "He would have liked the new barn," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. He was speaking of Silas. "He always said the old one had a draft that could freeze the devil himself." "And Billy would have already found a way to carve his initials into one of the beams," Clara added, a soft, sad smile touching her lips. The grief was no longer a raw, open wound, but a dull, persistent ache, a part of them now, woven into the fabric of their new life. Ethan squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I still see their faces at night," he confessed, the admission costing him a visible effort. "I see the fire. I see you fall." His voice was thick with the memory of that terror. "I wonder if I'll ever stop seeing it." Clara turned to him, her eyes clear and full of a love that was as deep and patient as the land itself. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but we don't have to let the ghosts have the last word. We are the ones who are still living. Ethan, we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to make this life count." He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down a mob, fought in a gun battle, and taken a bullet for him. She had shown him that a heart could be broken and still learn to love again, that a house could be filled with ghosts and still become a home. "Before you came," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his past, "I was just waiting to die. This land, it was a tomb, a monument to Sarah and Thomas. I kept it running because it was all I had left of them, a duty I had to perform. But there was no joy in it, no future, just one day following the next." He paused, pulling her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "You came and you planted life back into this dead soil. Clara, you made me want a future again." They knew that future would not be easy. This was still the West. The law was a day's hard ride away, and often deaf to the troubles of a remote ranch. Drought could return at any time, a silent, creeping thief. Bands of outlaws still roamed the territories, preying on the weak. The peace they had won was not a guarantee. It was a reprieve, something to be guarded and fought for, day after day. Morrison was gone, but the kind of greedy, violent ambition he represented would never truly die. It was as much a part of this wild country as the mountains and the sagebrush. "We won't be alone this time," Clara whispered, as if reading his thoughts. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they looked out at their world together. She was right. The battle had forged them into something new. The surviving cowboys were no longer just hired hands. They were a family, fiercely loyal to their boss and the woman who was its heart. The town of Redemption Flats, once a source of judgment and scorn, had become a tentative ally. They had seen the truth of Ethan's honor and Clara's courage, and in a land where strength and character were the only true currencies, that respect was more valuable than gold. As they walked back down the hill, the setting sun cast their long shadows before them. They were no longer two separate, lonely figures, but a single, united silhouette against the vast landscape. The theme of their life was written there on the land that love, fierce and unwavering, could rise from the ashes of prejudice. That loyalty, freely given, could build a fortress stronger than any timber. And that courage, found in the most unexpected of hearts, could stare down the barrel of a gun and rewrite its own destiny. The next morning, Clara was in the small patch of earth in front of the ranch house. The soil was rich and dark. Beside her on the ground was a small, thorny bundle wrapped in burlap. Ethan came out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, and watched her. She knelt, her hands, no longer delicate but strong and capable, digging into the earth. "What have you got there?" he asked, a gentle curiosity in his voice. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes shining. "I bought it from a traveler yesterday. He said it came from the East, but that it was a hardy breed." She carefully unwrapped the burlap to reveal the roots of a small rose bush. "It's a wild rose. He said it can survive the harshest winters and the driest summers. It doesn't need much tending. It just needs a place to put down roots." Ethan came down the steps and knelt beside her in the dirt. He took the bush from her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he placed it into the hole she had prepared. "A little like you," he said softly, looking at her. "Beautiful, and tougher than anyone would ever guess." She smiled, a blush rising on her cheeks. "I was thinking it was more like us," she corrected him. "It has thorns to protect itself, but it still makes something beautiful, even in a hard place." Together, they pushed the soil back into the hole, their hands working in unison, covering the roots. His hand came to rest over hers, pressing the last of the earth firmly into place. It was a simple act, but it was a vow to cultivate life, a vow to put down new roots. Together in this wild, unforgiving, beautiful land that was their home. They stood up, brushing the dirt from their knees. The small, thorny bush looked fragile and out of place against the vast, rugged backdrop of the ranch. But they both knew that within it was the promise of life, the resilience to endure, and the hope of future blossoms. It was a sign, a final declaration that the ghosts of the past no longer owned this house. The future did. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan McGraw looked at his home, at his wife, and saw not an ending, but a beginning. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey to the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners just like you, please hit that hype button to show your support. We'll see you next time, under the stars of the Wild West.